Hello everybody and welcome back to another Lateral Thrills video. I talk a lot about Kennywood on this channel, but I've never talked about the defunct coasters in the park. So let's do that today. These are the defunct coasters of Kennywood. So let's start off with our very first coaster, the Brownie Coaster. This is a WF Mangles side friction wooden coaster. The pictures shown and many other pictures shown in this video are not of the actual coaster. The picture will be a ride similar to the coaster being shown, like this one, which is a picture of a side friction wooden coaster. The coaster opened in 1928 and closed sometime in 1952. This was rumored to be where Kittyland is currently today, but there isn't much information on this particular ride, which will be true for most of the other coasters. Apparently, bathrooms were installed in 1953 after the ride was removed. Next is Dipper. This is a wooden coaster designed by Andy Vettel. This ride opened in 1948 and closed in 1984. This ride was renovated and remodeled after the 1957 season. Before the remodel, the ride actually featured a double dip, but the double dip was pretty small. But during the remodel, the double dip was removed and the height of the coaster increased from 25 to 30 feet tall to a crazy 40 feet tall, and even allowed for the ride to have two train operations, but knowing Kennywood, they were probably never utilized. Typical Kennywood. By the looks of the pictures of this ride, it looks like a pretty mild wooden coaster, and it wouldn't really have a use in the lineup currently, as the park already has two mild, ancient wooden coasters. This is near Ghostwood Estate and is actually where Raging Rapids sits today, so it was nice next to the Thunderbolt. The next ride is pretty obscure. The next ride is Whiz the Dips. This one doesn't have very much information, but we do know a few things. This is a wooden roller coaster, and it is a sit-down ride. This ride was designed by Frederick Ingersoll. This opened in 1902 and closed in 1921. This is also used to be called the Figure 8 Toboggan. There's rumors that this stood where Jackrabbit currently stands or where Penny Arcade currently is, but it is just speculation. Lastly, did you know this was the park's first ever roller coaster? Yes, Whiz the Dips was Kennywood's first ever roller coaster. Next up is the park's most famous defunct coaster, the Laser Loop. This is a Schwarzkopf shuttle looping coaster. This would launch riders forward into a loop and up a shallow spike. Then you would do this all backwards again. Then one last spike and the ride ends. This was a common ride model, but is now a very rare ride model in the United States. Montezuma's Revenge is the only Schwarzkopf shuttle loop still operating in the United States. The Laser Loop opened in 1980 and lasted 10 years at the park, closing in 1990 for Steel Phantom. This ride stands where Phantom's Revenge stands today. Actually, Phantom uses the same station from the Laser Loop. After being removed in 1990, it was moved to Azaltian Parque Urbano and was called Cascabel 2.0. It then closed in 2019 and was moved to Niagara Amusement Park, where it currently sits in storage. This stands to be a ride that put Kennywood on the map and introduced patrons to their first ever inversion. The Laser Loop was highly praised, but something even bigger ended up replacing it. This was a huge step forward for the park, as they now are in the steel coaster space instead of just being a park with a bunch of great woodies. Next up is Racer. Yes, there used to be an old racer right where the new one currently is. So let's look at the defunct racer. I'll be showing pictures of the new racer, however. This ride, like I said, stands in the exact same spot that the current racer stands on. The racer was designed by John A. Miller and was built by Frederick Ingersoll. The racer opened in 1910 and closed in 1926. Right after the old racer closed, the new racer opened in 1927. This ride was a wooden racing coaster. There isn't too much information on this ride, but this was a nice 1-2 punch with Jackrabbit for a couple years before the new racer opened, where the old one stood and changed the game. Next up is Scenic Railway. This is a railroad coaster, sort of like Switchback Railway at Cedar Point. This was designed by John A. Miller and Frederick Ingersoll. This opened in 1905 and closed in 1910. This was one of the shortest-lived coasters in the park's history. This ride probably would have looked very nice moving with trees scattered around it. These are very short rides that don't have any turns, so not much to talk about here. The next ride is Speedo Plane. This is a wooden sit-down coaster. This was built by Frederick Ingersoll and designed by John A. Miller. This ride opened in 1911 and closed in 1923. This ride costed a whopping $30,000, which doesn't seem like much now, but it was a lot at the time. This looks like a side friction wooden coaster, and by the looks of the coaster, it actually had decent drops. This was considered thrilling at the time. Based on the picture, it sure does look thrilling. This was located where Phantom's Revenge and Music Express still stand. This ride sure does look interesting. Next is Steeplechase. This is a steel coaster, and this was the shortest tenure coaster in the park's history. This ride operated from 1903 to 1904, so only a year for this coaster. I'm sure nobody really rode this then. This ride was very similar to the Coney Island Steeplechase. Based on that one at Coney Island, riders will board a horse and ride a ride chock-filled with small dips and drops. This is the first steel coaster in the park's history, so that means the ride must have some value. Up next is Teddy Bear. This is again a sit-down wooden coaster. Man, Kennywood has a lot of wooden coasters, present and defunct. This coaster was made by PTC. Teddy Bear opened in 1935 and closed in 1947. This coaster was a kiddie coaster, and based on the name Teddy Bear, it makes perfect sense. A whopping 21,233 wooden boards were used to make this coaster possible. Also, based on the photos of the ride, the trains were pretty small. This looks like a pretty moderate kids coaster. Next is Tickler. Man, what an interesting name for a coaster. Hey, I'm not the ones who come up with these names, but whatever floats your boat, I guess. This is a spinning wooden coaster. Yes, you heard me, wooden. The ride was made by W.F. Mangles. The ride opened in 1931 and closed in 1952. I was shocked to find out this was a wooden coaster, not a steel coaster. The ride looks very short, and honestly, it looks more like a flat ride than a coaster. It also looks more like a kid-centric coaster, but still a nice little coaster for the park. The last defunct coaster is Wild Mouse. This is a steel Wild Mouse coaster. The ride was made by B.A. Schiff and Associates. This ride was short-tenured, opening in 1958 and closing in 1960. The reason this ride wasn't at the park for very long was because the ride was owned by Ben Schiff. Kennywood tried to purchase the ride from Schiff, but to no dice. The rumor has it that the ride was sold to Conneaut Lake Park, but I guess we'll never know. This ride looks like your typical Wild Mouse, just small drops and terrible pacing. We have finished all the defunct coasters, but let's address two other coasters, Pippin and Steel Phantom. These two coasters got an RMC-like treatment, and Pippin became Thunderbolt and Steel Phantom became Phantom's Revenge. So let's talk about Pippin first. The Pippin was a wooden sit-down coaster. The coaster was made by John A. Miller. The ride opened in 1924 and closed in 1968. So let's go over the layout of the Pippin. The ride starts with a slow turn out of the station and into the first drop. The ride takes another right-hand turn into the second drop, which leads to the lift hill. The ride goes right out of the lift hill and slowly turns left into the next drop, which is a double dip. The ride then turns right into the final drop and then into the brakes it goes. The ride looks okay, but I think the double dip is amazing, even though they have Jack Rabbit in the park, which also has a double dip. It's a shame they lost the double dip, as you can never have enough of these crazy airtime moments on a ride. So, that's Pippin. Overall, it looks okay, but just not as good as the conversion of Thunderbolt with the lateral sections. And because of that, I think the upgrade/redo to Thunderbolt was a good idea. Also, did you know the lateral section on Thunderbolt did help me name my channel, which is called Lateral Thrills. Lastly, and I mean it this time, is the Steel Phantom. This is an aerodynamics hyperlooper. The ride opened in 1991 and closed in 2000. The Steel Phantom was a successor to the Laser Loop. So let's go over the layout of the Steel Phantom. The ride immediately goes into the lift hill, and when it crests the lift hill, you take a strongly banked right-hand turn and into a straightaway. Then you rise up a hill and you go into the crazy second drop. Then after the drop, you take a small turn and go into a vertical loop. After the vertical loop, you head into a bat wing. After the bat wing, you take a right-hand turn and go full speed ahead into a corkscrew. After this, you do a few more turns, and then the ride ends. It was an interesting and intense coaster for sure. It was also rough and janky, like an old aero coaster would be. All of the roughness caused the park to put in a trim brake right before the vertical loop. After the 2000 season, the park announced the ride would be closing due to decreased ridership and maintenance costs and roughness. The public was outraged and complained a lot, so the park had to act fast. The park decided to bring in Morgan Manufacturing to renovate the ride, and people loved the new Phantom's Revenge that Morgan made. This was a good move on the park's behalf, and I think the upgrade was definitely worth it. Well, that's it for all of the fun coasters at Kennywood. An interesting bunch for sure, with a lot of wooden coasters. The park actually has more defunct coasters than active ones, which is a little weird. Well, that's it for this lengthy video. This video took me forever to make, so if you could show your appreciation and treat this video well, that would motivate me to make more quality content for the channel. That's all from me. Lateral Thrills signing out.